Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining for what is an important update in the continuing response to the Mass Casualty Commission's recommendations. Before I share the microphone with my colleague, the Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino, thank you Marco, by the way, for being here with us today. I just want to offer a few thoughts on the ongoing emergency situation in my home province of Nova Scotia. By this time, you'll all be aware that communities across our province are ablaze. The reality is that the number of people displaced is approaching 20,000 as we speak. There are hundreds of homes that have been damaged and are at risk of being destroyed as a result of the wildfires that continue to impact Nova Scotia. Over the past few days, we've been doing what we can to make resources available to respond within our areas of jurisdiction, including aerial surveillance from Transport Canada. There are Coast Guard helicopters that are en route to the scene to assist now. Comfort trailers for crew and a number of other measures, whether you look at extending the fishing season for harvesters who've been impacted, and will of course be looking to continue to cooperate. Within the last hour, we have received a request for further assistance from the province of Nova Scotia. We are coordinating across all departments to identify how and to the extent we can continue to provide support. As the Prime Minister said over the past few days, the federal government is going to be there to answer positively to the requests of Nova Scotia and to Nova Scotians. Our priority is to help keep people safe during this emergency. A quick thought, for those who have friends, neighbours or family members who are impacted, look out for one another right now. These are challenging times, and to the first responders who are on the scene, we are so lucky to have your services. To keep people safe during an emergency like this is something I am so grateful for. To the extent anyone in Nova Scotia has an opportunity to say thank you to the first responders who are on the scene, please take advantage of the opportunity to do so. These are heroes living amongst us in our communities that are saving lives. Folks, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Minister Mendicino, to share an important update on making good of some of the recommendations from the Mass Casualty Commission. Marco, please.
Thank you, Sean. Merci. And as we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples. And before I do come to the substance of the announcement around an update on the implementation of the Mass Casualty Commission final report, I do want to echo the sentiments of Minister Fraser that the Government of Canada is working very closely with the Government of Nova Scotia to respond to the wildfires. I've been in touch with Premier Houston as well as my counterpart, Minister Brad Johns, on this. My colleague, Minister Bill Blair, is in very frequent contact with the government there. And of course, along with Sean and the rest of our colleagues from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, I beg your pardon, and all Canadians, our thoughts do go out to each and every one of you, and we will be there for you. And as we have been there for Nova Scotians at this very difficult time, it is important that we also acknowledge that this is shortly after the third anniversary of the awful and tragic shootings in Portapique in Nova Scotia in April of 2020. We know that it's been a little more than 3 years since then, but despite the passage of time, the trauma resulted in deep wounds, some plain to see, others beneath the surface, both equally felt by the community. Nous savons que le chemin de la guérison est long et nous devons faire tout ce qui est en notre pouvoir pour aider les familles à se remettre des pertes indicibles qu'elles ont subies. Le gouvernement du Canada fait sa part et s'engage à travailler avec le gouvernement de la Nouvelle-Écosse, les forces de l'ordre et tous les partenaires afin qu'une telle tragédie ne se reproduise plus jamais. Earlier this year, the Independent Mass Casualty Commission issued their final report, and I had the privilege of being present along with the Prime Minister, Minister Fraser, Premier Houston, as well as most especially the families who were impacted as the commissioners set out their findings. Their final report included numerous recommendations that would help to prevent and respond to similar incidents in the future, touching on police reforms that would strengthen, among other things, training, communications between police and government, emergency alert protocols, gun control laws, addressing domestic abuse and intimate partner violence, and relationship with Indigenous communities. The report sets out a critical path forward to reform the RCMP, reforms that are long overdue, and reforms that I want to be clear that I, in my capacity as the Minister of Public Safety, are committed to seeing through. To coordinate this effort, the Commissioner also recommended that the Government of Canada and Nova Scotia work together to establish an independent body to monitor both progress in advancing the important findings as well as being transparent with Canadians as we move forward. And today, in response to that recommendation, I am very pleased to announce, along with my Nova Scotia counterpart, Minister Brad Johns, that we are creating the Progress Monitoring Committee and that retired Justice Linda Lee Oland will be appointed chair of that committee with an initial one-year mandate. Aujourd'hui, en réponse à cette recommandation, j'ai le plaisir d'annoncer avec mon homologue de Nouvelle-Écosse, le ministre Brad Johns, que nous créons le comité de suivi des progrès et que la juge à la retraite Linda Lee Oland sera nommée président de ce comité avec un mandat initial d'un an. One of Justice Oland's first responsibilities will be to consult with the representatives of organizations implicated in the final report issued by the Mass Casualty Commission's recommendations and findings, as well as with other individuals, partners, and organizations in order to identify a list of proposed PMC members, as we are calling it, by this July. So this will happen very, very quickly. The founding chair will also ensure that the work of the PMC, this is the body that Justice Oland will be leading, is guided by a trauma-informed and victim-centric approach. De manière plus générale, le juge Oland jouera un rôle de premier plan dans le suivi de la mise en œuvre des conclusions de la Commission en favorisant les discussions et les relations, en assurant la liaison avec les provinces et les territoires, en dégageant un consensus et en recherchant des possibilités de soutenir le travail des gouvernements du Canada et de la Nouvelle-Écosse en vue de bâtir des communautés plus sûres. While the events of April 2020 are permanently etched in our collective memory, we have entered a new phase in our recovery. It is now up to the governments of Canada and Nova Scotia to take up the work outlined in the Commission's final report, to confront the tough questions that are posed in that final report, to work together with law enforcement, particularly the RCMP, to work with the families, the communities, the victims and the survivors, so that we can move forward. The Progress Monitoring Committee and Justice Oland are well positioned to ensure accountability and transparency on this front, and we very much welcome the next steps as well as the results of their work going forward. To all of the victims and survivors, friends and families of the Portapique and Truro shootings, and indeed all Nova Scotians, your pain will never be forgotten. No one should have ever had to endure the loss that you did during those awful 2 days in April 2020. We know that the wounds are still felt, but by making this next important step and appointing Justice Oland to champion the work of this committee, we will be able to see through the final report, address its recommendations, reform the RCMP, restore trust, and build confidence of Canadians in our law enforcement institutions so that this kind of tragedy never occurs again. Thank you. Merci.
Monsieur Mendicino, 3 partis d'opposition demandent le départ de David Johnston. Est-ce que la confiance du public ne commande pas qu'on lui demande de se retirer et qu'on trouve quelqu'un?
Malgré les attaques partisanes sur M. Johnston, je suis confiant que la qualité de ces recommandations évoquait un parcours pour l'avenir et ce parcours incluait des séances publiques. Et ça, c'est exactement ce que nous sommes dévoués de faire, parce qu'avec un engagement avec des Canadiens et Canadiennes, on peut renforcer les protections pour nos institutions démocratiques, on peut renforcer la confiance des Canadiennes à tout l'établissement de sécurité nationale.
Why not just appease the opposition parties and have a public inquiry?
This is not about appeasement. This is about doing the right thing. And what we have done since we have taken the reins of government is put in place the authorities that are necessary to protect Canadians from foreign interference. And it is the Conservatives who are engaging in the height of contradiction by saying one thing and frankly doing another. They say they want to be tough on foreign interference. They have voted against every single authority that our government, a Liberal government, has put into place. They say they want to lay to bear truth and facts. Mr. Poilievre continues to refuse to take the briefing. He should take the briefing.
But it's not just the Conservatives, it's the Bloc, it's the NDP, they all want a public inquiry, and today the NDP has put forward this motion calling for Johnston to step aside. So clearly there's unanimity there that the opposition parties want a public inquiry and they don't think that Johnston is the person to lead this path forward.
We're going to work with Mr. Singh. He has said that he is prepared to take a briefing. We're going to work with all parliamentarians. But the first step has to be to equip oneself with the facts. And we have said repeatedly now for more than a week that we are prepared to provide Mr. Poilievre with the same access that Mr. Johnston had to classified information. And for reasons that pass understanding, he refuses to take the briefing.
Is the government stepping up protection, RCMP protection from ministers and top bureaucrats?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Is your government stepping up RCMP protection from ministers and top bureaucrats in light of threats and other things that they're facing?
Yes, we've been vigilant about that. We've put into place a number of new protections, including providing panic buttons for parliamentarians, making sure that parliamentarians have a rapid response mechanism with information and support. This requires a community of law enforcement branches, including right here on the Hill, working closely with the Sergeant at Arms, as well as the Parliamentary Police Service. So we will continue to be vigilant because, quite frankly, the threat landscape as it pertains to not only elected parliamentarians, but the people that work in our constituency offices, the people that work on the front lines, and I would say disproportionately women, disproportionately racialized Canadians, disproportionately Indigenous peoples. They are the ones who have to be at the center of our work on this, and we will continue to add more to it.
On the Mass Casualty Commission,
I can't hear you all at the same time.
The RCMP called for the Mass Casualty Commission called for sweeping reforms to the RCMP, overhauling, taking a new look at contract policing, changing depot training, and completely eliminating it. Are you committing now to taking those steps, or only to think about taking those steps?
No, we're going to take the steps, and in my job as Minister of Public Safety, I am driving those reforms. We have made progress on a number of fronts, but what the Mass Casualty Commission final report makes abundantly clear is that there is still a long way to go on each of the critical areas that you have identified. What we have done today is put in place a respected, retired jurist in Justice Oland, who herself is a resident of Nova Scotia, with deep community roots, with an understanding of how these reforms can be taken from what are words on a page and translated into a reality that will mend trust and reform the RCMP is how we can build confidence.
You end training at Depot, just to be clear here.
To be clear, I want to make sure that we do that work with Justice Oland and the other members of that committee who will be appointed in very short order. But what I have said is that this is a report that is the product of many, many months of work, in fact, more than a couple of years, who have heard from a wide range of expert witnesses. And the fact is that we do have to take a hard look at how it is that new members of the RCMP are being trained. We've got to take a look at the way in which we can restore trust with Indigenous communities. I mean, we have here Jaime Batiste, and we had a very good conversation within the last couple of months in Escazone about how that trust has to be not only restored but strengthened. Some of the recommendations touch on that, particularly around training, and I'm going to keep a very open mind about what recommendations will be implemented with the guidance and the advice of a very respected former jurist in Justice Oland.
Out of 130 recommendations, those that fall to you, those that fall to the federal government, are you saying, yes, we're going to implement all of those, or are there some that you know that you cannot cross that line, that you will not be able to implement?
I'm not striking out the possibility of excluding any of them. But I do think it is important to underline that we have already moved on a number of concrete recommendations. Let's take one very practical one, emergency responses. As painful as it was over those 2 days, we have taken some lessons. And the RCMP are making progress in better leveraging social media, being public about where emergencies manifest so that we can keep Canadians informed about how to take practical steps to protect themselves. There are other recommendations that are already being implemented, and we're going to have more of a concrete update in the very short term about that. But I'm not saying no to any recommendations. I think it's the opposite. I think we have to be as open to implementing as many of these recommendations as we possibly can, as quickly as we can. And I've had a very direct conversation with Commissioner Duhaime, who, as you know, just completed the changing of the guard, and I know that he is committed to seeing this work through as well.
You're not announcing anything today, anything concrete or specific that would have stopped Gabriel Wortman from going on a shooting spree. There's nothing specific you're announcing today.
Well, that's actually not correct. The announcement of Justice Oland is a significant step because she will be part of the implementation and accountability body that will help to ensure the follow-through on the 130 recommendations. But let me come back to some of the other substantive progress that we have made. In addition to the emergency alerting improvements that the RCMP have made, recommendation C.21 of the final report suggested that the government strengthen the national ban against AR-15 assault-style firearms. We have acted on that recommendation by including a new technical definition, which just recently passed in this House by a voting margin of 2-1. So from where we were from a few months ago to where we are now is a significant stride forward in putting in place stronger gun controls that will help to reduce the likelihood and the risk of another mass shooting strategy. And that is the fundamental difference between what Canadians get with a Liberal government who sees the value of putting in place strong gun controls and what you get with Mr. Poilev's Conservatives, who would repeal all of this legislation and make AR-15 style firearms legal again.
Also said there are some aspects of RCMP management culture that are so bad, you can't wait for more reports. It has to be dealt with probably by September. Are you going to be able to meet that kind of time frame?
And I think that is a very fair question, and I am very cognizant of the fact that there are numerous recommendations that have recommended a path forward to reform the RCMP, and that is why it is so vital that we put in place Justice Oland and other members of the community and experts to follow through on the recommendations. The RCMP is at a crossroads, and what is important is that to mend trust, we have to implement these recommendations. Now, the Government of Canada is acting decisively and concretely already, and I have given two very specific examples in ways that will reduce the possibility of another mass shooting. But we need to work closely with the RCMP. We need to work closely with the Government of Nova Scotia. We need to work very closely with the families who are at the very centre of this work so that we can, again, mend trust and build the confidence of Canadians.
The longer that you take to, first of all, decide what recommendations you're taking and then get into the process of doing them, that Canadians are not vulnerable to another mass casualty situation. We have a tragedy, we have recommendations, and then there's a long bureaucratic process before anything really gets decided. What is going to be different in this case?
Well, Rachel, we've already acted on two very critical recommendations, so that shows
so long to decide on which other ones you will or won't do.
That shows our government's commitment to take action even before we set up this committee. But the reason why we are making this announcement today is because the Mass Casualty Commission had processed very much a part of the strategy to follow through with these recommendations. And so by appointing Justice Oland and by quickly populating the rest of that committee, we're going to be able to accelerate the progress that I think that your question cuts the heart of. I'm sorry?
What are we supposed to take from you waiting until the deadline day to make this announcement?
Well, first, we wanted to be sure that we got the selection right. And there were very important conversations that we had with the Government of Nova Scotia. I also think, in fairness to the families, we wanted to socialize some of the options that we had, including Justice Oland. As I said, she is herself a Nova Scotian resident. She is a respected jurist. She sat on the Nova Scotia Supreme Court. She sat on the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal. And so bringing the community along was part of the reason why we had to take the time to get this right. But now that we have appointed her as a chair, and I can assure you, as you heard in my remarks, that we are going to be filling other members on that committee very quickly by July, that we'll be able to make even a more accelerated progress on all the recommendations.
Already, like my colleague asked a question about whether or not you're going to implement those RCMP reforms we discussed, and it kind of sounded like you were deferring to this new justice you've appointed. Are you going to close the depot? Are you going to take those actions, or are you going to wait until she's appointed and defer to whatever decision she makes? That's not really her job. It sounds like it's about implementing them. So can we get a firm commitment that everything the report is recommended is going to get done?
Even as you pose that question with its urgency, and I understand why it's such a significant decision, because for the benefit of those who don't know, a depot is the main recruitment and training academy before you become a Mountie. It is a significant decision. And what the final report maps out is the fundamental principles and building blocks by which we can take a more evidence and research-based approach to modernizing that training. And in order to do that, you have to work with various communities, including the First Nations and Indigenous communities that are in Nova Scotia, that are right across the land. And so one of the touchstones has to be proper consultation as we make the significant reforms that are necessary to the RCMP. But I am absolutely committed to seeing it through, and I'm absolutely committed to moving as quickly as we possibly can, but in the right way.
Last question, Federal Appeals Court that the government does not have to repatriate 4 Canadian men who were accused of being part of ISIS. Does the government see this decision from the court as a win? What is your reaction to this? Because you've been challenging this.
Well, obviously the decision will be absorbed by the government. Our priority first and foremost is to make sure that we safeguard the country and our borders from any potential terrorist activity. And as we said to anybody who may have been traveling abroad for terrorist purposes, that is against the law. There will be consequences for that. At the same time, we are also have also undertaken a process and a framework by which there can be decisions taken around repatriation, but it has to be done in accordance with the principle of law, and we'll have more to say as we absorb that decision. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.